Now, for the Mavericks, they signed Tyler Dorsey, and he was a draft pick in 2017, second-round pick. He's kind of been lingering. He's been playing overseas. I know he played in Tel Aviv, then he played with Olympiacos, and he scored just under 13 points a game. So the scouting report is he's a solid shooter from distance, but then there are also people who question how his game translates back to the NBA. And let's be honest. Like, I get that people play overseas, but if you were like good enough, you would probably play in the NBA.
The other thing too is he's coming back to the NBA without a bidding war.
Yeah.
The Mavericks do see something in him, and I hope they're right about what they see in him. But usually, if a guy goes back overseas and they start dominating, usually there's kind of like 5 to 8 teams that are like, we'll give you the mid-level exception. Or,
to your point, like we've seen something like that play out in the NFL right now. Is the defensive MVP of the season for the USFL. I think he had like 12 and a half sacks. He's already has 3 tryouts for NFL teams, including the Steelers. So people are jockeying in position to try to make that happen. So I see your point. So I guess my question is, do you think they're finished making moves then? Because this fills up the roster, though that does not mean your roster has to remain exactly the same, of course.
I really hope not, and I don't think so, and here's why I don't. We are now 24 hours after the time that Jalen Brunson could have signed the contract with the Knicks, and he hasn't. 100% he's going to be to the Knicks.
Yeah.
So I do not want anybody confused that's out there on Twitter going, Jalen hasn't signed yet. Jalen has committed, okay? Get that through your head. Jalen Brunson is 100% a New York Knick next year. But he hasn't signed the deal because they are talking with New York, with Detroit, on a 3-way, possibly 4-way deal. So because of that, if the Mavericks were done, they'd be like, look, we lost Brunson. We don't care. It's fine. He's a New York Knick. Do whatever you want. We're done. But they're talking to the Knicks. They're talking to Detroit. They could be trying to pull a 4th team in there that adds a player to the Mavs or sends a player out somewhere else.
Or brings in a trade exception that we talked about.
All types of different things. I would say this. There is at David_Lord_20. He's a friend of mine. Sorry, _2020. He does a great job with all this cap stuff. He used to work on DallasBasketball.com with all this stuff. I would say you can follow him. He does a great job of trying to explain a very confusing cap in the NBA from a Mavericks perspective. Also, Dalton _Trigg has an article up that he put out about 12 hours ago on the Mavs exploring sign and trade on a 3-way, 4-way, room for Kyrie Irving or Ben Simmons. He's not saying the Mavs are getting Kyrie or Ben Simmons. He just shows that it's beneficial to the New York Knicks. It's beneficial to the Detroit Pistons. It's beneficial to the Dallas Mavericks to make this a sign and trade Jalen Brunson rather than to just, you're sending these to Detroit, we're sending, or Jalen signing with New York, everything's done. It can benefit all 3 teams if they can work out a sign and trade situation for future assets. So because of that, I do believe the Mavericks aren't done. They're either trying, to your point, get a trade exception, which is the easiest thing to get, rarely used, but easiest thing to get to possibly use within a calendar year. So if it happened today, you'd have 365 days to use it. I would hope they'd use it sooner than later to help out the team.
We just lost one as well. Why do you think the trade exception is so hard to make happen? Is it because teams are like, well, that's great, but like, we're not looking to just deal away? Because usually a player you would want is a player that would require asset better than just a trade exemption. Do you think that's fair?
I think they hold on forever going, no, we're getting something. And then that trade exception expires. I think teams aren't desperate to use it till it gets close to the end.
Yeah.
And then like, hey, we only have 2 weeks left. And then you call up. I'm not saying the Mavericks wanted to do this. You call up the Oklahoma City Thunder and you say, hey, you guys have too many players on your team.
Right.
That Isaiah Roby guy we drafted, we would give you our trade exception. Now it's going to go down to $1.9 million. What are we going to do with a $1.9 million trade exception? By the way, we still have time. Isaiah Roby's going to pull us in a future 1st round or 2nd round pick. No, thank you. And then time runs out on your trade exception. Then the Oklahoma City Thunder realize, oh, crap, nobody wanted to give us anything for Isaiah Roby. We're just going to have to release him.
Yeah.
So I think that stuff like that just works out. Hey, Cam Reddish. I don't think the New York Knicks want Cam Reddish on their team next year because I think he's going to be a disgruntled employee. Cam Reddish wants to play 24 to 30 minutes a night. I don't know if he can do that here.
I don't think he can, but at least straight away.
I think on a situation where we're like, hey, I think the Mavericks are probably concerned about Cam Reddish is a disgruntled NBA basketball player who wants to start or play a lot of minutes in a basketball game and show what he can do in the league so he can get a Jalen Brunson contract. Well, I think New York is holding on to him going, we can get more for him. We can get more for him. We can get more for him. And I don't know if finally they'll let him go for absolutely nothing. But does that make sense to you? This is why they don't usually get used, because the Knicks are probably like, no, we don't want a trade exception for Cam Reddish. We want you to give us a future first or something that we really want. And then all of a sudden they end up parting ways and they're like, I guess we should have done that.
Now, to go along with this, Mark Stein is saying that he's hearing they're still negotiating, but it's going to be a two-way deal probably for Tyler Dorsey.
Oh, it's not going to be so he's leaving $1 million something on the table to play overseas, or he can just go back. I wonder if he has an out. If I don't make the Mavericks as a 15-man player and you want to send me to Frisco, I'm going back to overseas and I'll play for $1.5 million.
As of this morning, they were still negotiating. So the framework is there, but it sounds like it's going to be a two-way contract. So when I said that the Mavericks roster is filled, maybe not necessarily, because that could reopen a roster spot, or to your point about the sign and trade and the potential options that gives the Mavericks, there's something there. But you don't think, and this is what I want to what I want to be cautious about is, then you hear names like you mentioned it, Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons. You didn't say they were coming to the Mavs, but they're in the ether for some people. And then we hear Colin Sexton. I do not believe it's going to be like a player of that level.
I'll tell you this. I was thinking about having him on the show, but there's just not enough to have him on the show
Colin
for.
Sexton?
No, Sam Amico.
Yeah.
Sam Amico, who is in the Ohio, I don't know if he's exactly in Cleveland, but he's part of the people. I think he is the person who put out Colin Sexton and the Mavericks, the connection.
Yeah.
And I personally talked to him. He's a buddy of mine. And he was kind of like, hey, the Mavs pretty much kind of poked around, but I don't know how much further it went than that. I was like, well, do you know what maybe Cleveland would want back from Dallas if there was some sort of situation there? He goes, I really don't. And then he said, it gets really difficult if you look into the sign and trade situation, because the Mavs, after this Jalen Brunson thing gets done, and you don't, if Colin Sexton isn't part of a Jalen Brunson deal, okay,
it's not,
or Kobe White isn't part of a Jalen Brunson deal, it gets way more difficult because the Mavs are over the luxury tax. And signing a player that is a free agent when you don't have any money and you have to make it a sign and trade gets very difficult for the Mavs to pull off.
And to go along with that, I think I might have been talking to myself a little bit with Colin Sexton, because then I saw the report yesterday that he wanted 20 plus million and they were like, no deal. And that his market is closer to maybe like 12 to 15 million, if that would open up some of the possibilities. And so somebody asked this, and I know sometimes we just go with vernacular. Can y'all describe exactly what a trade exemption is or would be? Can we go back to that and say, all right, so let's say, how do you get a trade exception and how can you use it, since we just saw that the Mavericks let one expire?
So a trade exception is, I trade Jalen Brunson. I'm going to be specific on this one. Jalen Brunson, and this gets confusing, but follow me. Jalen Brunson goes to the New York Knicks. We sign him. We trade him over to the Knicks. It's all agreed upon. The New York Knicks send stuff to Detroit. Then, because Jalen Brunson, in a very general, I'll probably get a little bit of this wrong, because if David Lord's listening, he'll be like, you got a little bit of this wrong. But if we send Jalen Brunson there and we don't get any player back in this deal, then we get a trade exception. That trade exception can be what the player signed for, but in this case, it'd be a little bit different. We would get a trade exception approximately at $12 to $14 million.
Right.
So now we have this trade exception that's just sitting there. And what we can do is we don't have to trade a player to the Chicago Bulls now for Kobe White, because they're like, we don't want a player on your team. We think all your players aren't good besides Luka. We don't want them, or they're getting paid too much money. Well, what we have for you is we have a trade exception. If you're not going to sign him and you're just going to let him go, you guys want a trade exception? We'll sign him to a $12 million contract. If Kobe White agrees to it, he wants to be a Dallas Maverick. Now we send you that trade exception to you. So we didn't have to trade a player, but we can't just sign Kobe White. We don't have the money. We don't have the cap space to do it. So that trade exception, you can get a player, what you'd call almost for free.
Yeah.
You can absorb a maximum of 2. You can't use, if you have a trade exception worth $35 million, you cannot get more than 2 players in it. You can use a trade exception. Let's say it's $12 million. You can use a trade exception for Cam Reddish, who's making $6 million. But that trade exception's gone. You don't have another $6 million to use. You've used that trade exception on Cam Reddish. That trade exception goes to the New York Knicks for what Cam Reddish was making.
And I think one of the frustrating parts is the Mavericks had a trade exception. And
Josh Richardson.
Yeah, and it expired. And that would have been one of your situations when you were looking like you're kind of limited asset-wise. That was an asset that you could have used to get somebody in. But you have to have another team that's like, right. Sounds good.
David Lord explained this. It was a bad trade exception in this. It expired on June 27th.
Right before.
This is, if you get a trade exception out of the Jalen Brunson deal, the reason it would be good is next year it would expire after free agency is pretty much done. So then you would be able to use it better. When you have a trade exception that expires right around the draft, it's a little bit tougher because free agency hasn't happened. Teams are looking at all types of different things. Hey, we're in the draft right now. Free agency starts in 5 days. We're not really looking to dump this guy on you here and there. It does happen. Like the New York Knicks said, hey, we're going to trade the 11th overall pick and just say, we don't want the 11th overall pick. But we're going to do this to open up cap space and dump it into a team that actually had cap space, not a trade exception. But you could use a trade exception in that case. So having cap space and trade exception, they're different, but they can be used similarly.